Thank you for the warm welcome. We'll get us started by asking everyone in the room to just think about the word failure for a moment. What comes to mind? What words do you associate when you think of failure? And I'll have you just yell them out. Audience participation moment. So, what? Guilt? Shame? Disappointment? Fired? Yeah. Anxiety? Absolutely. Frustration? Pain? Step backwards?
Next time it will be better.
Fingers crossed. Next time it will be better. Absolutely. Defensive? Sure. Up on the screens right here, you'll see the cover of the 5th annual Engineers Without Borders Failure Report. It is 27 pages, 14 stories that prove that this organization failed at least, probably more, than 14 times last year. Now, knowing that, what do you think of this organization and the people who wrote these stories to be published publicly? What are the words that come to mind when you think of them? And again, just brave, yeah, big one. Honest? Sure. What other words come to mind?
Vulnerable.
Vulnerable? Totally. Confident?
Aware.
Aware, make things better?
Relentless.
Relentless? Supported? Learning. Great. Do you notice a difference in those sets of words? You know, it's really amazing how different we perceive failure compared with how we perceive people and organizations who fail. And it's really in the spirit of expanding our perceptions of failure that I have the wonderful opportunity to be up in front of you speaking today. And I'll start by sharing my own story of failure, try to challenge our instinctive reactions together, and finally leave you with a couple of tips for failing intelligently. But as I said, I'll start with my own failure story. So my failure journey started when I was working for Engineers Without Borders in northern Ghana, helping subsistence farmers like Ella and Anikone here make a little bit more money from their farms. It was a great job, but I saw a lot of failures and learning at that field level. What I didn't see were those stories of failures and learning being shared with project managers, evaluators, or funders. And to me, that was such a shame, because all of that learning was being hidden, and those projects weren't getting any better, and Ella and Anikone weren't benefiting as much as they could from these projects. So I got back to Canada and determined to do something about this. I wanted to help the social change sector feel more safe of talking about failures openly. So I launched this website, Admitting Failure. It was supposed to be a database of stories. I expected thousands and thousands of stories that would flow in. Anyone around the world could submit their stories of failure, and I sold EWB this idea, got them to invest in the project with the vision of catalyzing a new era of collaborative learning in the social change sector. And they bought it, and they funded me, and I got this website up and running. 3 years later, there are 32 stories on that site. With some clever programming, it doesn't quite look like that, but yeah, 32 stories. Not quite the catalyzation of collaborative learning I had hoped for. And I still remember sitting across the table from the CEO of Engineers Without Borders as he looked at me in the eye and explained to me why this project that I cared so much about and believed in so much and wanted to see happen with all my heart and soul was a failure. But I was faced with a choice. Because as he's telling me that this project is a failure, I swear I didn't see it like that. All I saw was its potential for success. You know, I was stuck in this denial, trying to protect myself and my ego in my work. But like I said, I was faced with a choice. EWB was going to cut that funding whether I liked it or not. So I could continue to deny that it was a failure, Or I could try to accept that this idea that I believed in so much, in fact, just didn't work. And in my experience, this is a choice that many of us face in times of failure, because our human instinctive response to failure is often a defensive one. You know, we want to ignore that the failure happened, blame external factors, you know, deny our role in it, or try to fix it before anyone notices, or any other number of defensive reactions that actually prevent us from learning as much as we can from our failures. But like I said, you do have a choice in times of failure. And it's a challenging choice because it means fighting those instinctive reactions and instead choosing to accept our failures, acknowledge them, even appreciate what they can teach us. So in telling you my story of failure, I'm hoping to encourage every single person in this room to choose that challenging option. Be more open and accepting of their failures in order to open up that potential for learning that is there. Now, a huge part of today is about sharing our failures, and I really want to get us started with that now. So, just by a show of hands in the room, think to yourself, who in this room has failed at something? And again, just raise your hand. Yeah, everyone, right? Now, who in this room failed at something this year? Yeah, that's still just about everybody. And thank you for taking the courage to admit to that so early on in the day. And as you can see, you're not alone. I mean, and I'm not surprised. The work that we do is challenging. Still, I'm guessing that there's not many people in this audience that are really excited to run on up here and share their stories for this room of peers here. And I get it. You know, I talk about sharing failures like it's easy, and I know that it's not. And you can imagine in my line of work, I try to encourage a lot of people to speak openly about their failures. And when I do, I often hear two very valid criticisms or objections. And those criticisms tend to be, the ones that I hear over and over again are, oh, but Ashley, I do talk about my failures, or my team is great at this. You know, it's everyone else that doesn't. You should be talking to them. They need your help. And the other valid objection I get is, well, I want to. I know it's good. I know it would help, but I fear the consequences if I do. And again, just by a show of hands, I mean, who's ever felt this way? Who's ever feared that they'd be judged or punished if they spoke openly about their failures? I mean, who's ever wished at some point that someone around them would take more responsibility for their role in a failure? You know, that's the amazing part. I mean, we all feel like this. We all have moments where we wish that those around us would be more open and honest. We all have moments where we want to talk about our failures but fear the consequences. You know, we all want to share what we're learning but fear that others won't do the same. And the only thing that I have found that changes this is to set a new norm of talking about successes and failures all the time. And that's what we get to do today. I mean, you get to spend this day with these incredible, smart, inspiring, courageous peers, most of whom just admitted to you that they failed this year, and most of whom would be willing to share that learning with you if you're willing to do the same. So I really encourage you to be open and honest about your failures, and actually just before lunch you'll have a chance to share a story of failure with a partner. And in this way we are today setting this new norm of talking about successes and failures openly. But I'm afraid to say that new norm isn't quite enough. And I say that because, if you'll remember, my website was funded by a group that encouraged talking about failures all the time, and I still struggled to see my failure as a failure while I was in it. And it's related to this idea of confirmation bias, which is that human tendency that makes it really hard to accept evidence that says that we're wrong. So, and I mention this because it's important for all those people that put up their hands saying, yeah, I'd really like that other person to be more open and honest about their failures. There's a good chance that that person isn't hiding their failures because they're bad or deceitful. is a good chance they simply don't see the failure the same way that you do yet. And no amount of blaming or finger pointing or punishing is going to get them to see it your way. If anything, it just pushes them further into that instinctive reaction. So yes, there needs to be a norm about speaking openly about failures, but there also needs to be a norm of going into all these conversations with empathy and an open mind. I mean, any conversation about failure must be truly blameless. So I've talked a bunch about expanding and our perceptions of failure and challenging those instinctive reactions. I want to take one more step and really reframe how we think about failure. So I'm going to tell you a different kind of failure story. And this is a story that I heard after one of the first talks that I gave. A woman ran up to me and was so excited to tell me the story of when she first immigrated to Canada. And like many new immigrants, she felt socially excluded. You know, she just wanted to fit in, be a real Canadian kid, just be normal. And for her, that meant playing ice hockey. So she joined a team. She was absolutely determined to be the best hockey player ever. She went to every single practice drills over and over again, trying to get them just perfectly right, until about 3 weeks into her practices, her coach takes her aside and says, "Amina, you are just not falling enough." And Amina looks back up at her coach and goes, "I know, I'm trying to be the best hockey player ever." To which her coach says, "No, Amina, practice is for finding your edge. You need to know that exact point between when you're standing up on your skate blade and you're laying face down on the ice. And you need to know where that edge is so that you can push into every corner, every shot, every play as hard as you can. And how do you know where that edge is if you never fall?" So Amina takes her coach's advice after this, starts falling all over the place. And I love it when she told me this part of the story, because her eyes got so big and they just lit up. And she goes, "I got so much better so quickly after that." It's amazing, right? It's amazing how much our learning is accelerated when we push ourselves to the edge of our capacities. And David talked about this. You know, kids know this, whether it's taking those first few steps or learning to play the piano. We don't call it piano fail. You know, we call it piano practice. But as David mentioned, I mean, something happens when we become adults. We start to exert more control over our surroundings. You know, start to do things we already know how to do. And I get it, the stakes are way higher for adults. But it doesn't mean that we can allow ourselves to stop trying, to stop practicing, to stop pushing ourselves to the edge. It's a choice to see failure as a child does, as learning and as practice. So we're going to practice that now, in fact. And again, I'll have you all just think of a time that you failed. And just take a few seconds of silence and think about that failure. Great. Now, I'd like you to take a few more seconds of silence. But instead of thinking about that failure in terms of what you messed up or the mistake or the shame or the regret or whatever comes with it, think of it instead in terms of what you learned from that failure. You know, what changed for the better because that failure happened? What did you take away? How are you better today because of that failure? And just take a few seconds of silence and think of that failure in those learning terms. What would our lives be like if every time we failed, instead of pointing fingers, we simply just asked ourselves, what did I learn? And every time our coworkers or our partners failed, instead of blaming or punishing, we went up to them with appreciation and curiosity and asked, what did you learn? I mean, very obviously, these questions get us thinking about failure in terms of learning. And I do this because it's a tool, it's a tool for decoupling ego from activity. And this is what allows us to separate ourselves enough out from our failure that we can learn from them and start to fail more intelligently. And this is so important because as Eddie Obeng talks about in his book, The World After Midnight, failing intelligently is an essential skill. He talks about how the pace of change of our world has surpassed our ability to learn or have the knowledge needed to solve our most important and complex challenges. He said that this change happened about 15 years ago. Before that, if you failed, there's a chance that you deserved to be punished because the answer was out there somewhere. You just needed to look in the right place or ask the right person. But since that change happened 15 years ago, we're increasingly bumping up against problems that we have no idea how to solve, that have no answers yet. And all we can do in this new space is to try something, learn from what works and what doesn't, and in this way muddle our way to a workable but ever-changing solution. And this is what it means to fail intelligently. Eddie in his graph here really is asking us to push ourselves to the edge of our capacities, like Amina did in hockey practice, and in order to accelerate our ability to learn. So I was faced with a challenge when I started this website. I wanted to help people feel more safe talking openly about their failures in order to allow learning and innovation to thrive. I had no idea how to solve that problem. I launched this website. It fell flat on its face. But in doing that, I learned so much. I mean, it only has 32 stories on it to this date. But I did way more than that in media interviews. I had countless blog posts written about the site. Academic after academic was calling me, hoping to study the 32 stories that were on the site. And I realized that I'd misdefined the problem. The problem was that people didn't want to talk about their failures. It was just that it was really hard to do. And it's hard not just because we have this human and instinctive defensive response to failures, but it's hard because most of us don't have a buffer in our work for trying, failing, and learning. And it's very hard to take responsibility for our failures when there are real risks and consequences involved. So there's a gap. There's a gap between knowing we should fail intelligently and actually turning that into practice. Because just about everyone I spoke with in those early days about admitting failure loved the idea. I had these endless, excited conversations about harnessing the productive potential of failure and embedding learning and innovation into the DNA of an organization. And then those people would go back to their organizations and struggle to implement the change that we had envisioned. They saw that it could benefit them. They just couldn't figure out how. So of course, from that first project of admitting failure, I was able to take that learning to inform my next project, the organization I now run called Fail Forward, which is really dedicated to helping people bridge that gap between theory and practice. Because let's face it, we are taught how to succeed. We study successes, invest in the tools and processes that promise it, emulate successful role models. In contrast, all we're taught about failure is to avoid it at all costs. Now, it's no surprise we react badly when it happens. It's a skill we're never taught, let alone mastered. But after 3 years of being a full-time failure, I've learned a little bit about failing intelligently. So I'll leave you with a few tips to start putting that into practice and building that essential skill of failing forward. So the first tip is to practice decoupling ego from activity. This is what makes it easier to challenge those instinctive reactions and accept our failures. Think of failure not as a sign of incompetence, but instead as practice, as an indicator that you're operating at the edge of your skate blade, where learning is accelerated, and celebrate those around you that are doing the same. And spend time today, and every day, talking openly about what works, what doesn't, and why, and share that learning with others. And possibly most importantly, pursue something so important that even if you fail, the world is better off with you having tried. Thanks. All right, so as the title of this workshop might lead you to believe, this is your chance to start thinking about sharing your own stories of failure. Not in front of everybody, but you will have a chance to share with a partner. I have an hour with you in order to get us ready to do that. And we're going to, there's a few activities that we'll run through, sort of building our ability to share our stories, to maximize what we can learn from them. And hopefully by the end there, where we're getting to the heart of your stories, you'll feel comfortable sharing an effective story for learning. These are the goals that I have for this next hour. I would love everyone to walk away being able to listen to stories in a way that makes the storyteller feel safe and helps them learn. And of course, let us all walk away with the ability to tell stories in a way that promotes learning, gets us to understand the root causes, and supports the change that comes, an adaptation that comes from learning from our failures. But as that, overview or those goals suggest, you feel safe sharing your failure story and helping you learn. And I'd love for you, just in your table groups there, have that discussion. What would make you feel safe and help you learn when you share your failure stories? Just have a few minutes of that discussion at your tables. Great. Now, I'd like you to take a few more seconds of silence. But instead of thinking about that failure in terms of what you messed up, or the mistake, or the shame, or the regret, or whatever comes with it, think of it instead in terms of what you learned from that failure. You know, what changed for the better because that failure happened? What did you take away? How are you better today because of that failure? And just take a few seconds of silence and think of that failure in those learning terms. What would our lives be like if every time we failed, instead of pointing fingers, we simply just asked ourselves, what did I learn? And every time our coworkers or our partners failed, instead of blaming or punishing, we went up to them with appreciation and curiosity and asked, what did you learn? I mean, very obviously, these questions get us thinking about failure in terms of learning. And I do this because it's a tool. It's a tool for decoupling ego from activity. And this is what allows us to separate ourselves enough out from our failure that we can learn from them and start to fail more intelligently. And this is so important because as Eddie Obeng talks about in his book, The World After Midnight, failing intelligently is an essential skill. He talks about how the pace of change of our world has surpassed our ability to learn or have the knowledge needed to solve our most important and complex challenges. He said that this change happened about 15 years ago. Before that, you know, if you failed, there's a chance that you deserved to be punished because the answer was out there somewhere. You just needed to look in the right place or ask the right person. But since that change happened 15 years ago, we're increasingly bumping up against problems that we have no idea how to solve, that have no answers yet. And all we can do in this new space is to try something, learn from what works and what doesn't, and in this way muddle our way to a workable but ever-changing solution. And this is what it means to fail intelligently. You know, Eddie in his graph here really is asking us to push ourselves to the edge of our capacities, like Amina did in hockey practice, and in order to accelerate our ability to learn. So I was faced with a challenge when I started this website. I wanted to help people feel more safe talking openly about their failures in order to allow learning and innovation to thrive. I had no idea how to solve that problem. I launched this website. It fell flat on its face. But in doing that, I learned so much. I mean, it only has 32 stories on it to this date. But I did way more than that in media interviews. I had countless blog posts written about the site. Academic after academic was calling me, hoping to study the 32 stories that were on the site. And I realized that I'd misdefined the problem. The problem was that people didn't want to talk about their failures. It was just that it was really hard to do. And it's hard not just because we have this human and instinctive defensive response to failures, but it's hard because most of us don't have a buffer in our work for trying, failing, and learning. And it's very hard to take responsibility for our failures when there are real risks and consequences involved. So there's a gap. There's a gap between knowing we should fail intelligently and actually turning that into practice. Because just about everyone I spoke with in those early days about admitting failure loved the idea. I had these endless, excited conversations about harnessing the productive potential of failure and embedding learning and innovation into the DNA of an organization. And then those people would go back to their organizations and struggle to implement the change that we had envisioned. You know, they saw that it could benefit them. They just couldn't figure out how. So of course, from that first project of admitting failure, I was able to take that learning to inform my next project, the organization I now run called Fail Forward, which is really dedicated to helping people bridge that gap between theory and practice. Because let's face it, we are taught how to succeed. You know, we study successes, invest in the tools and processes that promise it, emulate successful role models. You know, in contrast, all we're taught about failure is to avoid it at all costs. Now, it's no surprise we react badly when it happens. It's a skill we're never taught, let alone mastered. But after 3 years of being a full-time failure, I've learned a little bit about failing intelligently. So I'll leave you with a few tips to start putting that into practice and building that essential skill of failing forward. So the first tip is to practice decoupling ego from activity. This is what makes it easier to challenge those instinctive reactions and accept our failures. Think of failure not as a sign of incompetence, but instead as practice, as an indicator that you're operating at the edge of your skate blade, where learning is accelerated, and celebrate those around you that are doing the same. And spend time today, and every day, talking openly about what works, what doesn't, and why, and share that learning with others. And possibly most importantly, pursue something so important that even if you fail, the world is better off with you having tried. You feel safe sharing your failure story and helping you learn. And I'd love for you, just in your table groups there, have that discussion. What would make you feel safe and help you learn when you share your failure stories? Just have a few minutes of that discussion at your tables. Great. So you all have a handout that says sharing our failures on your tables. And it has a listeners and storytellers guide. The first side is listeners, the right side, or the left side is listeners, the right side is storytellers. And so all this information that's up on the slide right now is actually in your handout in more detail. But as many of your comments from your tables, I'm sure, brought up, these are basically the basic things that a listener can do that creates that safe space for someone to feel safe sharing their failures and in a way that helps them get to the depth of learning. So these are things that I found through 3 years of doing this, what came out, but it's really just a beginning point. I'm sorry, I can't remember the woman's name over here who mentioned that, you know, it's really about talking to the person, making sure they know that they're in a safe space and figuring out what they need specifically to feel safe sharing their failures. But these are the general ones. Keeping an open mind to everyone's perspective. You know, you ask 5 people about a failure and you'll get 5 different perspectives most of the time. 5 different ways to see what happened. Remember, it takes courage to tell a failure story. Toby mentioned that when she invited our 3 brave speakers up here. It might look easy because they're great speakers and they're confident and successful, but it's really hard, and you always feel more vulnerable telling your story than your audience feels or senses when they hear it. And react with appreciation and curiosity for that learning. Never, ever react negatively. Again, just as this table contributed, making sure you take yourself out of it. It's not your role to react negatively or solve the problem. You're there to listen. And of course, for getting permission before retelling the story and asking so what and now what questions. And that's what really drives the learning and the depth of learning in the storyteller. And now we get to move on to the storyteller, building our skills of telling our stories for learning. So we're going to start with a safe exercise. We're going to fix my story. So you don't have to share your own story yet, though we will get to that. I told my story of failure in the talk that I gave just a few minutes ago. I'm going to retell that story a different way, and I would love for you to fix my story for me. Tell me, why it's such a hard story to learn from. So I'll retell this story now. I got funding from Engineers Without Borders to start a website so that failures and learnings could be shared. No one used the site. Engineers Without Borders cut funding to the project, so it failed. So it is, I think you'll agree, hard to learn anything from that story the way that I basically blame Engineers Without Borders for not seeing my brilliant vision and the possibility for success, as opposed to really looking seriously at my own role in it. But thank you.
I don't feel the passion. Also says passion never fails. Somewhere that could have been given to us.
Yeah, it's very dry. These are the facts, if you accept that those are facts, and there's no character to it, there's no emotion in it. Thank you. Anything else that would help you learn from this story? Debbie?
Nothing, all the things that you mentioned there are external. I got funding, no one used the site, that's external, and EWB cut the funding, that's external. There's nothing about you in that story.
Yeah. I mean, the way it's written, Engineers Without Borders should be telling this failure story, right? Because it's like I'm putting the blame on them. And if they're not willing to do that, I might need to look at myself and see what.
There were some stories on there, and it was getting attention from blogs.
All the nuance.
There's no credit
Yeah.
for that.
Huh. Great point. Thank you.
No analysis and an attempt to rebrand or retry with each format.
No next steps. What did I learn from this? What can I take from this? Absolutely. All great points. Was there another comment at this table?
There was an irony in that a website designed to share failures wasn't reflective about failure.
I missed telling a joke about the ironicness of starting a sub-website about failures that failed. Yeah, absolutely. Great. So again, these points are on your handout in more detail, and really you already mentioned most of them. Tell a story. People learn in narratives. How we tell our stories is very important for sharing those lessons. So make sure it is a story that people will remember. And pick one that has meaning to you. As was mentioned, that story is so dry. It sounds like I don't care about what happened when I really do. There's no way I should have blamed Engineers Without Borders for that failure. It definitely was my own failure. Looking for root causes. Why did those people not use the site? What did I do wrong? What were the assumptions I made that led me to build this website as opposed to figuring out what the actual problem was? And focusing on the learning. And making, at least 50% of your story about what you learned from it and moving on from that and what your next steps are. And of course, including perspectives from all stakeholders. This really what adds richness to a failure story when you can say, this is how I saw it. Engineers Without Borders, they were looking for that shift in everyone talking about failure and they didn't see it. So that's why they cut funding. It wasn't meeting their goals, which makes perfect sense. So really including those perspectives helps add that richness to the learning. Okay, so we've had our safe reframing of a failure story, where you fixed my story. Now it's time for the first chance for an audience member to share their story. So I'd love for one very brave audience member who has just a brief story, just in the interest of time, who doesn't mind sharing that story with the audience about a time you tried something that didn't work. Does anyone have a story like that they'd be willing to share right now? No, I'm putting you on the spot. Oh, we've got a couple. Great, thank you.
This just happened last week. I'm the director of education at Congregation Haboni, and we have a parent night every year. So parents can have a chance to meet the staff because we meet during the week, during work hours, and it's hard for parents who work outside the home full-time to make it to religious school. We don't call religious school anymore, but that's another. And so one night was 4th through 7th grade, and we had 12 parents show up out of a school of 150 kids. And the next night was kindergarten through 3rd grade, and we had 8 parents show up. And I know that the community is very happy, but what I didn't realize is that every secular school was having parent-teacher conferences that week, and every nonprofit was having their gala fundraiser. Let's get your contributions before the end of the year. I'm not loud enough? Okay. And so it was kind of disappointing just because all the staff came and it's out of their time and all the setup and the food and everything. But what was great is that the parents who sit on the committee and even parents who don't, they immediately came up and started giving me suggestions for next year. And then when I checked my email that night, I got more suggestions. And I really appreciated the significance, of that. And so next year we're going to have it the first week of December. Because really the whole point is just to meet the staff. People can have access to me and the assistant director, anytime. So that was a recent failure.
Thank you. Thank you. A lot of bravery, so thank you all for encouraging our teller of her failure. I am going to do my best now to reframe your story. I won't get it perfect. I'll probably have to make up a few things to sort of fill in the gaps. But here is how I think. So in reframing this story, I'm offering you a tool for how to talk about your own failures in a way that feels safer. So I'm going to reframe the story as a learning. And so this is how I would tell your failure story. So our school wanted to solve this quite challenging problem of having our parents engaging with the staff in a meaningful way and having them feel great about our school and the education program. Definitely not an easy thing to solve because there's lots of moving pieces, there's lots of people involved and different personalities, and it's hard to get a parent engaging in this meaningful way and helping them understand our school system. So we tried something. We tried hosting a couple of nights for parents to visit with our teachers. Unfortunately, only a handful of parents showed up each night. So our goal of really engaging our parents in our education program, we failed to meet that goal. But in trying that and in attempting to build this relationship with our parents, we learned so much. We learned that we have to be very cognizant of the other events going on around that same time, about what parents are engaged in. We learned also that we have this means of email and suggestion boxes and other ways of engaging parents to offer their thoughts on how they would like to engage in the school. So through this experience, we've actually learned how to better engage parents with our educational facility. Boom. So, oh well, I don't deserve the clap, definitely, the table does, but I'd love to ask you, what feels different about the way that I told that story as opposed to how you told that story?
I just gave people the outcome.
And you managed to frame the whole initiative and also remember to include the positive.
So, and it sounds like I'm trying to sugarcoat a failure. I've definitely been accused of that before, and I don't take it as an insult, because you're trying to create a space where you feel safe sharing what you learned, because that's what's really important about a failure. You'll never hear me say, yeah, let's celebrate failures. Failures suck. Like, it hurts. You know, they come with risks and consequences, and I never deny that that's the case, but what deserves to be celebrated is learning from it and moving forward. So it's really just focusing our stories on that aspect. All right. Is everyone good with that? Got some notes? Great. It's now time for the moment you've all been waiting for, to share your very own failure story. So you've fixed my failure story, you've heard me reframe a failure story. Now I would love you to find a partner. So I'll just give you a few seconds now to find the partner that you're going to share your failure stories with. And just find, yeah. All right, so just a second. We're not sharing our stories just quite yet. Just find that person you're going to partner with. Okay, does everyone have a partner? Okay, put up your hand if you don't have a partner. If you can hear my voice, clap once. If you can hear my voice, clap twice. Great. Does anyone not have a partner to share their failure story with? Anyone? Just put up a hand, we'll find you a partner. Great. Looks like everyone has someone to share their stories with. Okay, great. Is there someone? You have 3? All right, put your hand up really high if you don't have a partner. Anyone? All right. Great. Okay, so with that, we have you're a third? David or Debbie, do you want to join one of these groups just to make sure? Brilliant. Thank you. Okay. So it's right over here, Debbie. Great. That was the biggest, that hopefully will be the biggest challenge of this activity, that logistical piece. Thank you all for managing to find a partner. Now, everyone, as I mentioned, will have a chance to share their story. We're going to have one listener and one teller. And the teller will have just 60 seconds to share their failure story. And then the listener is going to ask questions. And then the teller will have just 30 seconds to tell that same story again, reframed. And again, the listener will ask questions. And then we're going to switch. So listener becomes teller, teller becomes listener, and we'll do that again. This is going to happen fast. It will feel rushed, and it will be a challenge. I promise you that now. But this is intentional, and it's intentionally rushed in order to really push and encourage you to focus on what's the heart of your story, what's really important about the story you're telling. But as I mentioned, it will feel rushed, and you're going to hear me clapping at the front here. So please do listen for my cues from the front to make sure that we can all come back together, as we'll have to do that a couple of times. So, to start this off, as I mentioned, everyone is going to share their failure stories. One person will go first, and then you'll switch. But for the next few seconds, I just want you to take those seconds of silence and think in advance of the story that you want to tell. What story are you going to tell? How are you going to tell it? And just take a few seconds now, and then I'll tell you who goes first in a second. Has everyone got a story in mind? Do we need a few more seconds? Who are we? Great. All right, team, we're almost ready. I'm going to have the person in your partnership who is closest to that wall be the teller. So if you're closest to this wall, which is, you're the teller. If you're closest to that wall, you're the listener. And I'm getting my stopwatch ready. So as I mentioned, your teller, you're going to have 60 seconds. Are you ready? I'm going to give you a couple of warning signs, but I would love the teller to get ready to share their story in 3, 2, 1, go. You're at 30 seconds. "20 seconds left. Just 10 seconds remain. Teller has put themselves on the line for us. Thank you all to the tellers. It's the listener's job to ask the questions that are going to help your teller learn as much as they can from that story. So I have some suggestions up on the screens of so what and now what questions. So why does this failure matter? You know, what were the consequences of it? And of course, what would you do differently? What did you learn from this in order to inform your actions going forward? And of course, feel free to ask any other questions that you're curious about. Don't feel you have to follow this as a model, but they're great suggestions to start with. So I'll have you in your partnerships take a few minutes to discuss these questions and help your partner learn. If you can hear the sound of my voice, clap once. If you can hear the sound of my voice, clap twice. Oh, brilliant. I'm so sorry to cut off those discussions. I know how rich they can be, but we're on to the even more challenging part of this exercise. The teller will tell their story again, but this time in just 30 seconds. And just because that's not quite hard enough, I'd love the teller to take a few seconds now and think about what is the 30-second telling of that story that incorporates that learning that you just discussed with your partner? How do you tell your story in 30 seconds that focuses on that learning? So I'll give the teller a few moments now to think about what that story sounds like. And then I'll start the timer. Are you ready? 3, 2, 1, go! All right, great job, guys. I know how hard that is. I've done it myself. So good jobs trying to fit your failure stories into 30 seconds. Oh, if you can hear the sound of my voice, clap once. Great. Okay. Now again, it's our listeners' turn to ask the questions. And this time the questions are still focused on learning, but actually pushing into what the story means. Questions, again, for example, that I've put up on the board that you can start with are, why is this story so important to share? In particular, why would this story have relevance to someone outside of your context? I mean, what are the broader learnings that are more widely applicable? Why is it important to them? Is this failure story a part of any trends that you see, perhaps in your industry or in your organization? What does this failure story cause you to question? How would other characters in this story talk about this failure? And of course, these are just guidelines. Feel free to ask any questions that you're also curious about. So again, a few minutes for discussion now. I'll bring it back together. If you can hear the sound of my voice, clap once. If you can hear the sound of my voice, clap twice. If you can hear the sound of my voice, clap 3 times. Great. And again, I'm sorry for cutting off those discussions. I do know how rich they can be, but it's time to switch. So tellers become listeners, listeners become tellers. And now that we're all great at this activity, you know the drill. So our new tellers, hopefully you still have your failure story that you want to tell in mind. And you have 60 seconds, just 60 seconds to tell that story, starting in 3, 2, 1, go. Helps the teller focus on the learning aspect of their story and dive deep into what they can learn from that failure. And just as we did the last time, that teller has 30 seconds to retell that story with the added challenge of focusing on the learning that you just discussed. So again, I'll give the teller just a few seconds to think about what that story now sounds like in half the time and with a focus on learning, and then we'll start in just a few seconds. All right. Teller's ready. In 3, 2, 1, go. What would other characters say, and why is this story important to people outside of our context? So again, I leave it open for that discussion. Brilliant. Okay, thank you all. And I'm sorry for being a clapping dictator up here. It's not my favorite part about facilitation, and I know how great those discussions are, and I really appreciate everyone in the room who was able to share a story today, and that's the whole point. And I'd love to take just the last few minutes here that I have with you for this session to ask you, what was that experience like? When you were telling your story, what was it like to share your story? What did you experience when you were listening to somebody else's story and hearing them dive deep into the learning and the meaning of that story? What was your experience when you listened? And what are you taking away from this activity? And I'd love for you just to put up your hands if you have anything to contribute. Please.
So when I was listening to my story, when we share a failure, we should know I was actually pretty impressed at the attempt.
Thank you. Thank you.
As a listener, to try and control the kind of empathetic feeling, like I felt, I literally, like physically felt the frustration that the person that was sharing with me. So to try and control that, to be a genuine listener and get the facts of it and kind of suppress my outrage.
Thank you.
When I told my story, I really made it sound like they in the story, and even when questioned, I think I still went to they. I did not own my role in it fully, and until this moment.
Thank you. That's powerful stuff.
I love how the proportions changed. I mean, having a minute to talk about it, I spent maybe 10 seconds or so on this is what I learned, and having 30 seconds to talk about it, I spent about 10 seconds on that. And that was really powerful.
Thank you.
Sasha and I both shared stories of failures that were sort of in right now, which I think was different than a lot of what I heard earlier today, which were failures that people were looking back on. And one of the results from that was that we actually ended up workshopping a little bit and seeing how his failure can help my failure and vice versa. So there was a little bit of problem solving that happened.
Thank you. It's very hard to share a failure while you're in it. So that's really neat. Thanks for sharing that.
I'm feeling very raw right now. So it definitely had a very physical moment for me to make myself vulnerable, and I'm like in the aftershock of it still too. So like I want to recognize and acknowledge that other people might be feeling that way too.
Thank you. What are you taking away from this exercise? Does anyone have thoughts on that?
It's not just me. I don't know where everybody else comes from, but you tend to get so wrapped up in your own work and so forth that you don't just sit down and share these things. Or vent these things, except of course the dinner table when somebody wants to quickly solve all your problems for you, and you just feel that it's not just me. It's not just my ego that was shattered.
Thank you.
I think that it's very hard to do is to say things in 60 seconds, 30 seconds. Maybe that's part of one of the things we have to learn to do because it narrows down the issue.
Thank you.
Just the juggling between passion and precision, and that each one needs to find its voice in those 30 seconds. Nuance is lost if either of those are not fully present.
Thank you.
We spent a little bit of time in the conversation across about who else could benefit from hearing this story. And I think that was sort of opened the scope of our, like,
Thank you.
It occurred to me a little bit in your introduction to the exercise, but then also as we were sharing stories, that we all get into everything with the best of intentions. And we don't know where it's going to go wrong. You kind of know something's going to go wrong. You don't know how large or small it will be, but very few things come off exactly how we hoped. And as much as this is all really, really important, I think we also have to allow each other some time maybe, like the story about the parent conferences. It's great that you got that feedback right after, but sometimes we need to be able to kind of have a moment to appreciate what we actually did and how much work it took to get there and what did come out of it before we start getting bombarded with, oh, you should have, and this is what you could have. There's also plenty of time for should-haves and could-haves, to not just have people bombarding us with, this is what I would do if I was doing this. And, you know, it's okay to have that space too.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Liz did something really amazing, which is she was going to ask a really tough question, and she said, I'm going to ask you a really hard question now. And that kind of acknowledgement was so helpful because I wasn't, I didn't feel put on the spot. I felt like, she had acknowledged that it was hard to answer, and she was going to give me a second to think about it, and I really appreciated that.
Thanks. Yeah.
I was going to say, it takes time to process this. I'd say, sort of when I was sharing my story, thinking about the process and what I learned from a perceived failure, it actually changed over time. So for me, it's still, I think, like a lot of people, it's an ongoing learning process, and so that should be valued. And I think that there's a great balance, at least in our, our conversations, between empathy and also challenging in a really constructive way. So I think that helped, for me, certainly move my thinking forward.
I often get asked to define failures, and I'm the worst person to ask to define what a failure means because I see that all the time. Failures change with time and perspective, and that's a great point. Thank you.
I appreciate that we need the time to reflect, but I think sometimes we also wallow. And given the 60 seconds or even the 30 seconds, it doesn't allow us to wallow in our what we perceive as our failure, but rather kind of spurs us on to action, to move forward, to either learn something or to take measures to move beyond it.
Thank you.
I'd say that the way the initial story is told felt to me like not so important. That if you just have the outlines, the base things, that the story comes out in the conversation. And that the challenge is just getting the story, however you're going to tell it, out. And you can deal with it.
Thank you. And just we have time for just one more comment. I think we.
The question of how other characters in the story would perceive the failure or how they would see it, I thought was really interesting because I felt that and when we talked, I was making a lot of assumptions about how they perceived it or how they saw it. And how much would I love to go back now 8 years in time and really talk to them and find out how they perceived it and also learn from it. And I think as I'm now going forward, to ask those questions, and if that happens, and to open it up to those people and say, let's talk about it, because I think there's so many learnings that can emerge from that.
Thank you. It's a great comment to end on. I'm out of time, but just before we break for lunch here, I would love everyone to look at their partner and just appreciate that they were willing to share their failure story with you. So just a big thank you. Brilliant. All right, I had the chance to eavesdrop on a bunch of conversations, and I loved to hear the excitement in your voices about engaging with these topics. And I would love for you to share with the whole group some of the things that came out of your discussions. So as you were talking with your table, did anything come up? Was there anything you think is worth sharing with the group? Please, I'd love to hear any reflections from your table discussions.
Sometimes the journey of exploration begins with, well, not, I guess not sometimes, but the journey of exploration begins with asking the right question.
Can you elaborate on that?
So again, if we don't ask the right questions in what we're seeking to accomplish, certainly the wrong answer will come out. However, when reflecting again and seeking the right questions, again, that could lead us in a direction that we're really looking to head in. So again, in terms of failure is, did we begin to ask the right question for what we were trying to achieve?
Thank you. What your comment reminds me of is that, yes, we need to adapt our solution, but we might also need to adapt the definition of our problem, in fact. Thanks. Anyone else? Reflections from your discussion? Oh.
One of the things that we talked about is the idea that of success and failure as two sides of the same coin, and they are so closely linked that you almost can't have one without the other. That anything that is deemed sort of a quote-unquote successful event can always be improved upon, and a failure you can always learn from. And so depending upon your frame, it can always be both. And so that was one of the things that I ended up feeling stuck on almost, of what does this look like in practice and how does it manifest itself in your organization? How do we also stop and acknowledge success in a meaningful way?
Thank you. Yeah, great point.
We spoke a bit about emotional safety and interpersonal relationships in the workplace, and how the importance of like suspending blame or suspending reactivity amongst coworkers, how to develop those kinds of working relationships where people really actually feel emotionally safe to discuss their failures, and the building of trust, and how that is kind of where the rubber hits the road of whether people are actually able to.
Thank you.
I wonder to what degree the word failure is important, because I noted in our conversation that failure got turned into a little bit shortcomings and areas for improvement, and I'm wondering what your view of that is, since we're so focused on failure today.
Turning the questions back around on me, I like it. Keeps me on my toes. As you might expect, I get challenged on using the word failure almost every day. You know, come on, Ashley, like, I like what you talk about, but really, like, you're really talking about lessons learned or best practices or areas for improvement. Like, why have you got to stick by failure? You know, it'd be so much easier to talk about these other things. And I agree, it would be. And nevertheless, I stick by the word failure because I think that those terms have been around for a very long time. You know, we've been talking about lessons learned and best practices for a while, and what I saw was that they just weren't creating the kind of conversations that I thought were needed. So I stick by using the word failure because I think it's powerful in our emotive reaction to it to create those kinds of conversations. I would never be prescriptive and say that anyone else has to use that word if they're going to embed this in their organization. Do whatever works for you. It has just been my experience that that kind of lessons learned language doesn't necessarily lead us to really talk about what happened. So thank you. Any other reflections from that discussion? Please. No.
We did talk about language and how if maybe you have a culture that's resistant to, you know, the idea of failing forward, how changing the language can maybe make it easier.
Brilliant.
Along those lines, using the language that we already have, most lay leaders want to talk about things that went well, don't want to talk about things that haven't gone well. Staff perhaps as well. Jewish history, Jewish sources, the Torah certainly talks about failure a great deal in different contexts, and framing it or utilizing it from that vantage point, I think, gives us an opportunity to talk about these things and then bring it home to the agency that we work with.
Thank you to both of you for your reflections. Any other thoughts on that one?
I was talking actually about the Jewish Education Project. What struck me was really embedding your reflections on failure as a day-to-day part of the work. That, you know, this is not a one-off exercise we do, etc., but we are continually reflecting on what we are doing, and this great phrase, second learning loop. That you do something, you reflect on it, and we use those lessons when we do it the next time. And that, I think, sort of has an authenticity to it that helps people in the organization embrace it and say, this is not just like a command from on high, like a fad that we're going to talk about for a few days, and everybody's going to forget about it in 6 months. It's a real thing that is permeating the organizational culture. That was what struck me.
Thank you. And that double loop learning, if we're talking about the same thing, is a really powerful message. It's not just learning from one failure, it's almost learning how to learn and building our capacity to learn faster or in our organizations. It's worth looking up, I guess. So thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, you.
Failure, I think, is also
excuse me, embedded in clarity about our goals. You can't really know if you're failing if you don't know what you're trying to achieve, and we often aren't as clear as we could be.
Certainly. Thank you. Are there other reflections? Great. Just as I'll hand it over to David just in a minute here to lead us into the next activity. But really, when we're talking about this fail forward idea within our organizations, we are talking about an organizational culture change. So to bring it back to the Engineers Without Borders failure report, that slide that I showed you that was the cover of the 5th annual one, there's this misconception that that is a learning tool, that all of a sudden you have those stories published in that report and that organization learns everything from those stories because they're published publicly and changes their behavior that year to never make those mistakes again. And I can tell you that that is just not true. Actually, the last story in that same report is called Failure to Learn from the Failure Report. And I put it at the very back so that I could show people this is not a great learning tool. Just because we share our failure stories doesn't mean that anything changes. And I bring this up because it really is about shifting the culture. So why I still support this organization to create this report is because by creating the report, they create a culture where people are encouraged to talk about failures all year round, not just once a year when the report's published. So the report is really, the report could be blank, essentially, because what's really important is that those discussions are happening every single day and shifting the culture as they go. So that can very much be a part of your discussions as you head into the next activity, talking about the practical elements, the benefits, the challenges, and how to actually turn those failure stories into learning. But I'll leave it to David to send us off into our groups.